Hi, my name is Dale. I'm one of the pastors here at Redeemer Bible Church, and we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 today. A very important chapter in all of the scriptures. Just to set some of the context for you, if you're just joining us in the Daily Word, Paul is addressing the Corinthian church here. And Paul had spent time with the Corinthians, lived among them, pastored them, and had been hearing things about some of the disputes that they were having. And he's been addressing those things in this letter. And today we find ourselves right in the middle of him answering another dispute that's going on, obviously, inside the church. That is the married versus being single. What it is to be married, how we're to treat one another in marriage. He addressed these issues in chapter 7. Obviously, as I said yesterday, there's just no way to unpack every verse here and give it the attention that it's due. So I'm going to highlight a couple different verses here and just talk briefly about them. And if you have any questions, obviously you can make a comment. I will try to get on YouTube and or Facebook or our website and look at some of the comments and answer them as I can. So first point in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that I want to address is found in verses 3 through 5. And I think this is important for the married. As a biblical counselor for many years now, more than I would care to admit, one of the main issues that I see in marriage is sex being used as a tool or a power play, meaning the withholding of sex from one spouse to the other because they're trying to control or manipulate a situation. And Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Why? Because human nature, the fallenness of sin, there are some predictable patterns of behavior. So God addresses this for us as Christians. Don't act like the world, just like we did on Saturday, how we talked about, like, listen, we don't sue one another. In marriage, we're not going to act like the world either. As two Christians who are married, we're not going to act like the secular world does, where pagans would, in the context of marriage and or sexuality, to use it as a manipulation. So let's read verses 3 through 5, and we'll talk briefly about it. It says this, starting in verse 3. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, husbands, you have to keep reading here. Let me start over. I'm going to start all over again, okay? Because I lost my place. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Here's a critical verse. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again. Why? So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul is saying here is, listen, sexuality, sex in marriage is so important. The enemy will target one of you or both of you if you're depriving one another, except by the mutual understanding and or agreement to fast and or to pray through a topic with one another. So, sex is powerful, which is why I brought it up about manipulation and a power play, because it is powerful. If you deprive a spouse of sex, you're putting yourself in a position of control. And the scripture here is saying, do not do that except by mutual agreement. That both of you are going to abstain for a spiritual reason. And then you're going to come back together quickly, it says here. Why? So that you're not tempted by the enemy. Now listen, I know after being in the counseling room for as long as I have again, that this is a major tension and a major reality in the lives of many, many, many couples in the church. I'm going to encourage you pastorally, and I'm going to preach to myself on this. You cannot abstain and or use sex as a tool to control and manipulate your spouse. It's sinful and you can't do it. Paul is addressing it. Why? Because of the spiritual danger that's involved. That's why. There's a spiritual danger involved when you do that. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it play out. Affairs, pornography, a lot of different things start entering into the mix when sex is used as a power play and or a manipulative tool. Now listen, every situation is different. I get that. If you're listening to this and you're like, hey, I think I need biblical counseling, I think I need help with this in my marriage, our pastors are here. Come in and talk with us and let us help reason with you through the scriptures about why and how you should fight the temptation to use sex as a power play in your marriage. Now, Paul goes on. Another thing I want to talk about is the topic of being single versus being married. Obviously, there's some controversy here. The Roman Catholics have taken this into a direction that I don't think is biblical, with priests abstaining from marriage. Paul does not, in my reading of this and in the commentaries I've read, which I agree with, Paul does not elevate marriage against singleness or singleness against marriage and say marriage is somehow more holy or God favors more. That's not the argument Paul's making. What Paul is saying is, listen, when you're married, you're going to have tension because your first ministry is now going to become your spouse. And it would be better for the church if you didn't have that. Meaning you'd be more available. But Paul never says here that you should not marry in the sense of if you're burning with passion and you need to marry, you should. And it's not sin to do so. So I think it's important to address that. The other part of the scriptures that I want to address are verses 10 through 16, because I think they're important and I think they're misunderstood by a lot of people. Good people who just have a disagreement about this passage, and I want to read it. So let's go down to chapter 7, verse 10, and let's read all the way through verse 16. So to the married, so Paul's addressing married people now. I give this charge: the wife should not separate from her husband. Now, parenthetically, Paul says something here. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. So what Paul is saying here is, listen, you leave your husband, you're not eligible for remarriage. It's clear. Jesus addresses this as in the book of Matthew. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So if you're unequally yoked, you can see 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, I have it in a note. Okay, stand by. 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through 18 as a cross-reference. You should remain married to an unbeliever. And she consents going back down to the verse 12. And she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Now let's talk about that. That word holy doesn't mean saved. Now, your salvation is not going to save your unbelieving spouse. That word holy means set apart, sanctified. Somehow, your unbelieving spouse is being blessed and living a better life than they would without you. They're think about it this way. If God is pouring his holiness out over you, his blessings out over you as a believer, it's more likely that that's going to sprinkle on and or be visible to your unbelieving spouse, and may perhaps, and you can see 1 Peter chapter 3 for this, perhaps draw them into a place of salvation. But Paul's not saying that your remaining married and your salvation is going to save them. He's just saying they're set apart differently than if they were married to a non-believer. I want to make that clear. Verse 14, I'm going to read that again. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So they are living with a believer. They are set apart because of your faith. But If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. If an unbeliever leaves the marriage, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. So your oath is not going to be held against you. I think is what the NIV says. Your oath will be held against you no more. You're not enslaved. God has called you to live to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So Paul's saying, listen, if they're willing to stay with you, if they're willing to remain married to you, let them. And yes, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be challenges, obviously. There's challenges married to a fellow believer. Of course there's going to be challenges married to an unbeliever. Paul is saying here, which means God is saying, because God is the author of all Scripture, Christian, if you're unequally yoked, it's not ideal. Yet, remain married, unless that unmarried person leaves you. And if that's the case, God is going to release you from your vows. You're not enslaved. You're no longer enslaved to the vows you made to that spouse and or God, and you're free to remarry. So I wish I had time to go into the rest of the chapter, but for the sake of time and for the sake of finishing up this video, I will go ahead and end it there. And again, if you need help, if you're watching this from anywhere else, go to your church and ask for help. If you're married to an unbeliever and you need encouragement, you need help to remain married, as the Scriptures call, let us know. Let us know, or let your church know that you need that help, and they will walk with you and encourage you to live out the Christian faith with an unbeliever. If you are married to a believer, remain married. Remain married. Get counseling, get help, and don't hold the beauty and the gift of sexual union. Don't hold it over each other's head. Your body does not belong to yourself, but to your spouse, because God gave you your spouse as a gift, and there is a mutual submission in the context of sexual marriage, or marriage and sex. Forgive me. Anyways, that's enough for the day, and I'll be back tomorrow in 1 Corinthians chapter 8.